Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth and final webinar on the topic of operating at non-controlled aerodromes. My name is Terry Horsam. I'm an Aviation Safety Advisor with CASA, and I'll be hosting you through the next 45 minutes or so. Before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to make sure that everybody's muted at this point. Just makes life a little bit easier. So Landy will be backing us up on the technical side of things. The session will be recorded and it will be available on the CASA Pilot Hub shortly after. As I mentioned, about a 45-minute to 1 hour session today, depending on the number of questions that we get. And on questions, we can leave the questions till last. There's not a great deal of people in the meeting at the moment. So what we might do is if you'd like to pose a question through the chat box, my colleague Rob Whittle, who's also an aviation safety advisor, who's based up in Brisbane, will attempt to answer those questions, or he'll just save them till the end. Once we get to the end of the presentation, we will actually be going ahead and opening up for a chat, basically. So feel free to have your questions ready at the end to ask of our presenters. So as I mentioned, Terry Horsam, Aviation Safety Advisor based here in Adelaide, with Rob Whittle, Aviation Safety Advisor based in Brisbane. Today, though, I'd like to introduce our presenters, and I'd like to also start off by thanking each individual presenter for making their time available to us. It's really important. This is a very important safety initiative that CASA is presenting at the moment. It's part of our Your Safety is in Your Hands program that we've rolled out, and it's great to see these really experienced instructors giving their time today to, as I mentioned, this very important safety initiative. So without further ado, I'll just like to welcome aboard Neil Boag, who's Flight Standards Manager at RMIT University at Point Cook. We've got Chris Gill, who's Aviation Support Coordinator with RAAus, and Stefan, Alman, Safety Manager and Flight Instructor at Moorabbin Aviation Services. And each individual presenter are experienced instructors, and so we're going to be really interested to find out their take on this important topic, which is, as we mentioned, loss of situation awareness in the circuit, and can I prevent it? If you've seen the previous webinar, you would have noted that we did talk about situational awareness then, and this is a continuation of that, and we hope to provide you with some hints and tips to maintain situational awareness in the circuit. If you did happen to miss out last time on the webinar, as I mentioned, it is available on the Pilot Hub through casa.gov.au. But before we get too far into talking about preventing situational awareness, we might just go back over some ground that you're probably familiar with, but we'd like to sort of just run through the what is situational awareness, so that we will start from a level playing field. And one of the things that we sort of covered last time was basically a very simple model of situational awareness, which has been adapted from Micah Ensley. Now, Micah Ensley is an engineer, and Micah was the former chief scientist of the United States Air Force. Her work in the 1980s came up with a model of situational awareness, which is currently used in aviation, but also in other safety critical industries. So just going through what we're looking at the moment, we've got Micah's model, very simplified. For those students of human factors, you would recognise the levels, but there's also a lot more going on in the model that she proposed. But we've tried to break it down a little bit into the terms that we as pilots will use on a daily basis. So the first one, I guess, we're looking at is level 1, which is perception, and put simply, it just means what has happened, and it's taking in the information. So what's happened? Level 2 is comprehension. A lot of people just, when we ask about what is situational awareness, they kind of sit on this one. They kind of go, well, it's the big picture, what's happening now, but it's understanding the information. And level 3 is projection, which is one of the more important ones, but what might happen? And it's projecting ahead, evaluating what's occurring in the circuit, for instance. Now, as you can see, there is a connection there between when you finish with level 3, you're actually going back around to level 1, because things change. Things don't stay the same. Situational awareness is is a moving feast, literally, and everything is occurring at the same time, and you're having to put all these levels of perception, comprehension, and projection into play. And then you go back to the beginning again. So if, for instance, at level 3, your projection, what might happen, you understood, you've configured your aircraft, or you've positioned your aircraft in the circuit to, say, follow another aeroplane, and then something else might happen. That aircraft might go around, or there may be another aircraft join the circuit. So then you've got to continue with situation awareness. Now, my take on this particular model is that if at any point you get any one of these levels incorrect, or you misperceive it, then it's going to affect the other one. So obviously, if you get the what has happened and your perception is wrong, then that'll lead through to comprehension. You might make a decision based on what has happened, but it wasn't what actually did happen. And of course, then that affects as to your what strategies you put in place at level 3. So really, you've got to continually build your situation awareness. Level 2, yeah, absolutely, what is happening, but importantly too, what might happen, and what will my actions now result in the circuit. So leading into the instructors, then it's an interesting thing. It's because we've simplified the model. We know there's a lot more to situation awareness than what we've just talked about there. So from an instructor's perspective, I guess I'll put it to you, Neil. Can you actually teach situation awareness, or is it something that's actually inherited through experience?
I think it's a little bit of both the areas you've touched on there. I think some people have more of an innate understanding of situational awareness. I think we've all seen various levels of that on the roads, for example. But certainly within the aviation context, there are elements of that can be taught to make it relevant to the area that the pilot is finding themselves. But the one thing I just wanted to quickly touch on in terms of the diagram you've got there, perception, comprehension, and projection, all of those come into the decision-making process. And that's what I don't think you want to lose sight of, is without one of those, you're not going to make the right decisions. And certainly from an instructor's point of view, we're continuously looking at an advancement in the ability of the student to do all of those things, and the outcome of that is in the you'll see in the decision-making process. So short answer, little bit of an innate ability, and some that can be taught to make it relevant to the context.
That's great, thanks, Neil. Stefan, as a grade 1 instructor, would you agree with those statements from Neil, or do you have a way that you teach situation awareness? You know, when does it begin, and how do you do that in the aircraft?
Yeah, I agree with what Neil said, that it's a bit of both. It's not very black and white, unfortunately, and it's quite a subjective term, situational awareness. So unfortunately, it's not something that we necessarily have a lesson for, where a student comes in, you do your lesson on situational awareness, and they leave, and now they have such adequate situational awareness. It's something that, so maybe teaching it isn't the right word. I agree with what Neil said in terms of there's certain elements that we can use to foster situational awareness, or certainly enhance it. In terms of how we go about doing that, it very much depends on the student's cultural background. Neil mentioned driving before. We find that we've got some students that come to us without a driver's license, so they've never driven a car before, and the difference in situational awareness between those students and students that have driven a car is chalk and cheese for us. So we base it in terms of the student's background, what sort of situational awareness they'd have in their own life experience already. And then try and assess where it's at in the aircraft. And for me, I think one of the best places to assess situational awareness is in the circuit itself, because it's where the heaviest workload exists. The aircraft's in different configurations. You can have aircraft coming inbound, outbound. So it's really where all three of those, perception, comprehension, and projection gets amplified within the circuit. So putting the student in that situation, and then basically in levels, depending on where the student's at, trying to build up that situational awareness from level 1 all the way to level 3. But it's certainly from an instructor's point of view, and talking to other instructors, I think it's the most difficult thing to teach, because there's no necessary, there's no mandation of situational awareness. It's integrated in everything we do.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Hey, Chris, how do you go about that sort of I guess, integrating situational awareness at RAAus. Is there anything specific that you've got for your instructors, or is it very similar to I guess everywhere else in aviation?
Yeah, so again, we're encouraging to start from the ground up. Situational awareness starts from before we turn the prop. Making sure we have clearance around us, making sure that we clear when we taxi, making sure that we are aware of what's happening before we even get to takeoff. But again, situational awareness is driven in right from the beginning, from very first, trial flight, making sure students are aware that, we've got to continually assess what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future, because where those aircraft are, the other aircraft are in the circuit is changing all the time. And so we foster that information processing, having an understanding that in the initial stages of training, students are perhaps overwhelmed. So getting them to reassess and change priorities continually, focus on regaining situational awareness, and then back to task and vice versa. So it's a continual development, and certainly we're pushing for that.
Yeah, that's great. I sort of I like the analogy with the driving, because as Neil quite rightly mentioned, we see examples where situational awareness on the road is not all that apparent. I like to reckon it when people talk to me about it. I put it down to when I was an instructor, you'd be teaching, say, initial circuits, and you'd say to the student, okay, so, what number are you in the circuit? And they'd look at you blankly and go, what, there's other aircraft in the circuit. And, just before you send them on the first solo, you could ask the same question. You go, what number are we in the circuit? And they will come back with an answer, say, well, we're number 3, we're following a Cessna on base, which is following the Cherokee on final. So you're able to then assess from that perspective that people have built up situational awareness, or at least they have a level of competency at that point that you're comfortable with to send them on, say, a first solo. And it's definitely within the circuit, as Stefan has said, that is the most concentrated area where we really have to be on top of our game when it comes to, showing that skill of situational awareness. And again, it's continually changing within the circuit. So as far as the level of competency goes, Neil, you've sort of touched on the point there that people do sort of reach that level. Some people have it. It's an innate sort of quality that they've already got, that they can sort of multitask, if you like, if you want to use that terminology. So how do you judge a level of competency on situational awareness? Is there something that do you tick it in the box? Do you have something that is on your checklist when you're about to sort of send somebody off?
A little bit determined by the scenario you're in. If you're into if you use your example of sending someone solo, if you're in a circuit that's quite busy, you'll see that evidence throughout the dual component of it. But what I'm looking for to determine someone's proficiency at situational awareness or competency is that there should be little or no input from the instructor, other than in your case that you mentioned, asking a few questions. If there is no traffic there, you could put in a scenario of an aircraft entering the circuit. What would you do? How would you handle that? Right. But you're looking at the student's ability to assess what's going on around them and to problem solve, and they are looking at being able to project that ahead, and from that make sound decisions. And it comes back a little bit to touching on a threat and error management, that they can identify a threat, which can be someone coming into the circuit. If it's not managed, it is a threat. If they themselves make a mistake or another aircraft makes a mistake, there's an error being made. How do you then manage that? And so you're looking at all of those things. But at the end of the day, the student at first solo, at a license test, whatever it might be, has to demonstrate that ability to do it without instructor input.
Yep, Fantastic. Yeah, I agree totally. Yeah, the more you withdraw, and I'll ask that Stefan the same thing. The more you withdraw from the situation yourself, more whilst maintaining your own situation awareness, of course, the more likely you are to sort of tick the person off and let them go on a first solo or a first nav or something like that. Would you agree with that, Stefan?
Yeah, I agree with exactly what Neil said there. It's basically where the student can sort of start to think for themselves, and you're able to step away from the aircraft and they can make their own decisions. So a lot of instructors will talk about being ahead of the aircraft, which is basically another term of referring to situational awareness. So an example was I was flying with a student entering a non-towered aerodrome the other day. And he demonstrated a very adequate level of situational awareness because he was able to, basically, as he heard call signs from 10 nautical miles of other aircraft in the circuit and another aircraft overflying from the circuit, he would write the call signs down. He was able to tell me, okay, this is what Alpha Bravo Charlie's doing, this is what this aircraft's doing. So based on what they're doing, here's what I'm going to do. So that just demonstrates a good level of projection where he can clearly show me he's got an understanding of what's happening in the circuit. And now here's what he's going to do to make his own life easier, and also the traffic's life easier as well. So that just means that I can sit there and just listen. I don't really have to get involved myself too much. And it shows that he's got an understanding to the point, or she has an understanding to the point where they can start to teach themselves to a certain extent based on the procedures that they have around them. So that projection level.
So I suppose back to that original question, Chris, about can you teach it? It's you can certainly give people sort of guidance and tools, etc. But in reality, they probably build it themselves. So I don't know what you might think on that.
Yes, certainly understood. That's a continual development within the students' progression through the training syllabus, and certainly agree with those sentiments passed on by Stefan there.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, we'll move on. From what I've taken from that, then is that it's situational awareness. In a way, it's sort of difficult to define. We know we've heard a few terms there. Keeping ahead of the aircraft is absolutely one of them. Knowing what's going on around you, building the big picture, and all that sort of stuff within the circuit. So let's have a look at a few of the barriers, and we won't talk to all of these individually. But there are barriers to situational awareness, or to maintain situational awareness in the circuit, and it's in no particular order. So these things are challenges to everyone, and they when you look through them, there's enough sort of barriers to situational awareness. But what I'd like to do is have a look at the mitigators for each of these particular barriers that might be. So just to get us started, I guess if I looked at something like communication, now communication can be any number of things. As we know, it can be a miscommunication, it can be a misheard radio call, and we started off this series talking about radio procedures within non-controlled aerodromes and the importance of standard phraseologies, speaking clearly and concisely, knowing what you're going to say, not blocking airways, etc. So there's a lot of that goes on as mitigators, I suppose. But what would be a reason why communication might be a barrier, do you think? And I'll start again with you, Chris, if you wouldn't mind. So communication as a barrier to situational awareness, what do you think about that?
So there's a couple of key things I think can be an issue here. Is certainly we come across people from all walks in life, from all different cultures, and pronunciation and clarity within the radio calls is very important. Likewise, for a lot of Australians, I think sometimes we can ease into our colloquialisms and start using non-stated phraseologies, which can lead to incorrect situational awareness. And my current hot topic at the moment is we kind of assume that everybody out there in the circuit is competent, and we very quickly forget that we were once learning how to fly and were struggling to manage, the radio and the aeroplane. And when we have student pilots out there, we do find that there's times where they incorrectly communicate with us. They might say, I'm joining crosswind when they're actually joining downwind. And so there's a number of issues with the communication. As long as we have that in mind, we can use it to start to build our situational awareness, but it's not confirmed until we've actually established the facts.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's something that, I think that we can all be familiar with, is that when we do enter the circuit, they're going to be pilots with varying degrees of experience in that circuit. Now, you can't always tell by their radio procedures. Some people sound like they've been flying for 50 years on the radio, but may have only just started. They may have a few hours under the belt. And that's not to say they're not competent to be in the circuit, but it can lead you into thinking, almost like a false sense of like, oh, this guy sounds like he knows what he's doing. But, for instance, if he calls downwind for runway 13 and he's actually get downwind for 31, that could cause a bit of confusion as well. I like the idea that you talked about use of colloquialisms. I've heard people making an inbound call where they said they're going to be in the circuit in a mo. Now, growing up in Australia, I know that what that means. It means they're going to be there shortly. But to somebody who maybe doesn't speak English as their first language, in a mo is just a colloquialism and means nothing. Similarly to, if you're just using localism, as in, I'm going to be joining the circuit overhead Fred's farm, well, who knows where Fred's farm is. So these things can be a barrier to situation awareness, because not only do they sort of don't give you the big picture, they may even, in fact, give you the wrong picture. And as I mentioned, if you get one of those elements of situational awareness wrong because the information that you've perceived, your mental model is one thing, and if somebody's giving you the wrong information, then that can really throw you off as well. So if we work our way down to things like time pressure, what do you think about time pressure, Stefan, when we talk about operating in the circuit? And I think I know what I'm trying to get at here, but why would time pressure be a barrier to situation awareness, do you think?
This is where I find a lot of students struggle, and even instructors sometimes going into an aerodrome or in the circuit. We know we've got, let's say in a general aviation aircraft, we've got 5 or 6 minutes to complete a circuit, and in that time we've got various checks to go through. But sometimes depending on how much of a workload we've got inside the cockpit, and it's little human errors that could build up, little things that build up, and you might struggle to do them to get everything done in an efficient amount of time, and that leads you to forget certain things. You start to forget to make certain radio calls, and I think that's what's important with all these barriers as well, is that we're used to, as humans, we make little errors here and there, but it's when they all start to build up and we start to fall behind the aircraft where time starts to become more of an issue. And you just get more panic from there on, and everything just starts to snowball from there. So I think time pressures is definitely what I found with a lot of our incidents at our flight school. Quite often students make more mistakes and get into a situation where they lose situational awareness due to the time pressures that's been put on them coming into an aerodrome.
Okay. Yep. That's really interesting. Time pressure is one of those things that in reality, when you look at it, most of it is self-imposed. It's not really something that you have to sort of I suppose manage. Well, you do have to manage it, but a lot of it, if you just looked internally, you'd go, well, why am I rushing this, or why do I have to do this? Some people also think that they have to fly a circuit at flat out, and I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is that aeroplanes actually can be slowed down within reason, of course, and you don't have to necessarily be, going flat out on downwind. You can actually sit behind somebody. You don't have to, just because you've got a high performance aircraft, for instance, is one of those things. I guess the next one would be, and it's a fairly major one too, when it comes to situation awareness, and we do have a slide a little bit later on it in the management, but we're talking about distractions. So Neil, how do you teach a student to manage the obvious distractions that are going to be occurring, particularly in a very busy circuit?
That's an interesting question, but it's again coming back to the fundamentals of aviate, navigate, communicate. got to prioritise what it is that you need to do, and you've got to look at the importance of what is distracting you. If someone's talking to you, is it in fact a distraction, or is it a core piece of information that you need to understand? Is it something that you can put off if someone's talking to you just to ask you an irrelevant question about something going on in the circuit? Tell them to stand by. And there's a lot of different scenarios you might find yourself into, but what that does is it stops you from concentrating on the important task at hand.
Yeah, we do have a bit of a note later on about aviate, navigate, communicate, and I think some of those basics, it's the default position, really, isn't it? If and we're going to talk about, how do you, well, we are talking about how do you prevent losing situation awareness, but it's definitely something that you need to manage. You need to be aware that you've been distracted, and that could be from a radio call, as I mentioned earlier, with the communication side of things. You could be distracted with other traffic. And as we go down this list that we've got in front of us, things like equipment failure, you've got an unfamiliarity with equipment, unfamiliarity with procedures, and unfamiliarity with the aerodrome. Well, most of those, particularly the unfamiliarity ones, you should be able to manage that by planning, and that's right. Kind of what we're getting at. Situation awareness, I think we mentioned in the beginning, really starts well before you get out to the aircraft, and it probably even starts a couple of days before you're going out to do your flying. You're looking at the news on the TV and seeing what the weather's going to be like on that particular day, and that's how you start to build up your situation awareness. From that perspective as well. Yeah, look, there's other things in there that are obviously human factors. We've got things like biases, and the thing about biases is that we don't know that we've got a bias until it shows itself. And then in hindsight and retrospect, we can look and go, oh, the reason I made that decision was because, and it could have been that you've got away with it before. So you've got a confirmation bias of some description. You might have some sort of continuation bias, which is why you didn't go around in the circuit. You went ahead and landed when you probably should have gone around. Fatigue is certainly a big one, that we don't always take into account, but we do know that the more fatigued you become, the less likely you are to make good decisions. And also your decision making does deteriorate quite rapidly. And as you quite rightly put out there, Neil, it's all about decisions. Does anybody else want to add anything? Any of the instructors want to add something at this point? Nope. Okay. Look, we'll move on to the next slide, which covers off on some of what we would call red flags, and it's adapted from Flight Safety International. And I'm going to just run through all of them here, but we've talked about quite a few of them. So, ambiguity and confusion. What do you think that is all about, Chris? When we talk about ambiguity and confusion in an aircraft?
Well, there's different different areas which we can find ourselves confused on. Certainly, when we're approaching unfamiliar aerodromes, we can find that the runways can give us a perceived incorrect runway. Like as per Moorabbin, you've got runway 31 and 35. And where you're coming in from the city, from Brighton, it naturally leads you into one runway, but it's actually maybe not the correct runway. So we can have a bit of ambiguity and confusion in, especially in high load type scenarios where approaching a busy aerodrome.
Absolutely, and I guess the description of ambiguity is, there's more than one answer perhaps, or there could be conflicting information which doesn't necessarily match your own mental model. And what do you think the remedy is for that, Stefan? How would you, if somebody got confused in an aircraft, how do you get them to get unconfused, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think it depends on the scenario and the student sometimes. Yep. If you go back to situational awareness, it's probably taking them back to that model we speak of, and basically, we always remind them to aviate, navigate, communicate. So depending on what the situation is, just telling them to go back to just flying the aircraft, and then from there trying to rebuild the picture around them in terms of what's actually happening, trying to take care of themselves, build that picture in terms of what they want to do, and then they can start to ask themselves questions from there. You know, where am I? Where do I want to be? What do I need to do to get there, basically? So just going back from square one and trying to build that picture again from the ground up. But it's very difficult because it depends on the situation.
Yeah. Sorry about that. It was a bit of a difficult question to answer because you just don't really know as to how the confusion has arisen. And I suppose within the instructor ranks there, how do you know when you've lost situation awareness, or have you ever lost situation awareness in a circuit or at any point really when you've been teaching? Anybody want to answer that one? Neil, do you want to start with that?
I'll have a go at that one because I reckon we've all been there.
I think so, yes.
Look, as an instructor, one of the big traps that you can fall for, been there, done that, is that you're so intent on your little world of you and your student, and some flights, as we all know, can be heavily dual, and that can come to, with a loss of situational awareness. Right. I've done it myself, where I thought that I had the traffic ahead of me sorted out. They flew a longer downwind than I had expected. I was talking to the student going, right, well, this is where we should turn base. Let's do that thing. And we turned inside the other aircraft. And I wasn't aware of it. And I was sitting there going, he's here somewhere, but he was out on my left side, not on my, not ahead of me. And as a result, we ended up having to go around, which is the one thing I did want to touch on, because what that escape plan is of a go round or climb up out of the circuit is to give you enough time to eliminate the ambiguity or the confusion that you might have, get a handle on what's going on, and then re-enter the circuit with 100% understanding of what's going on. It happens to us all, but if it does happen to you, you've got to have an escape plan. Okay, I've lost the picture of what's going on. Now what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with that? How do I rebuild this situational awareness and getting out of the circuit, giving yourself time? It may well just be slow the aircraft down if you're in the circuit, but give yourself some time to nut it out and don't make any assumptions that you think you've got it right without being sure.
That's a really good point, and I guess you'd agree with that, Chris, or maybe not. I won't put words into your mouth. Do you think that extracting yourself from the situation, if you find that it's all getting a little bit too much, is the correct way to go about it?
100%. You've got to buy yourself some time, and continuing on in a confused state is only going to lead to disaster. And as Neil was saying, you've got to have your escape plan. 100% agree with that. You've got to re-establish situational awareness to put yourself back in the safe zone before you continue onwards.
And I think that goes for pilots of all levels of experience. You don't need, we're all going to make mistakes, or we're all going to get into a situation where, we might be following a slower aircraft and there's just no way that we can slow our aircraft up to fit in behind it. And, you just go around and have another think about it. But if you know that you're starting, I like to sort of bring this one up occasionally, but the catch-22 of situational awareness in my book anyway is that if you know that you've lost situation awareness or you are losing situation awareness, then you must have situation awareness. So to go through that escape plan, if you like, or extracting yourself from the situation, says actually you do have situation awareness because you're aware that something's occurred.
It's important to remember that we have control of what we're doing. We don't have control of what others are doing. And whilst we may have a very good situational awareness picture right now, somebody can just overtake on the left or overtake on the right or descend down from a high downwind or something. And that is a moment where you've now lost situational awareness, not because of something you've done, but something somebody else has done. And so you have to re-establish and replan.
Yeah. That's really good, really good advice, because we sort of use the terminology sometimes, expect the unexpected. Well, absolutely. People are not necessarily. One of the good things about predictability in the using predictable radio phraseologies is that you know, we expect people are going to be doing the right thing, but occasionally people get them wrong, you know, as we do. And you know, to be on alert for that is something we will talk about actually as we're going through. We're coming up close to sort of about 35 minutes now, so we've got a few minutes to keep going. So fixation is another one that we're aware of, and they can occur. You can become fixated on possibly just one other aircraft in the circuit to the detriment of maybe others that may not be well, possibly not making radio calls, or they're not showing up on any other anywhere else. They just happen to be there. Loss of control in the circuit is one too, where you know, we talk about situation awareness, and essentially in the circuit, you know, our biggest problem would be a mid-air collision. But don't forget that you know, you can become distracted to the point of failing to fly the aircraft, and for those not familiar, that LOC is loss of control. And that can happen. I read somewhere in one of our excellent flight safety magazines that you know, people think it's always going to happen on base to final turn, but essentially there's a lot of loss of controls in the circuit. Have you got any knowledge of that, Stefan? Have you ever seen that where people have actually failed to fly the aeroplane, the Aviate thing that hasn't happened?
Yes, yeah, and it's usually due to distraction, as we spoke about before, or fixating on a certain item. And then, you know, they start to lose the ability to fly the aircraft. Another example is also, we notice it quite often on go-arounds when students are in their initial phases of circuit training. Yeah. They'll commence a go-around, and the very first thing they often want to do is get on the radio and inform everyone, including tower, if you've got a tower that they're going around, forgetting about actually flying the aircraft. And quite often they'll get into a stall, or they'll dump all the flaps in one stage. They start to rush and snowball from there. So yeah, reminding them to aviate, navigate, communicate, super important. Just fly the aircraft first, and then you can worry about everything else around you from there. Just worry about yourself first.
So excellent. Thanks for that. So what we're saying here, these are red flags. These are things that you should be, you know, aware of, because what they're saying is that you could be in an error chain, or you could be at the start of an error chain, or you could be towards the end of an error chain. So if anything unexpected happens, as in the next one, unexpected situation or a surprise of some description, that can distract you. You can have an airprox, you know, where you don't actually collide with another aircraft, but you come very close, and that can throw you off as well. So you can lose your situation awareness as to where you are in the circuit after that. If you find that you can't meet, you know, your speeds and altitudes, if you're not flying the aeroplane accurately, that could be a clue that you're losing situation awareness as well. We've got in there failure to comply with limitations and regulations. A lot of that comes because people just forget. They forget what they're supposed to do. They become overloaded. And finally, the last one on that list that we've got in front of us is the failure to communicate by using non-standard or vague radio transmissions. So you know, you're either not saying what you should using non-standard stuff, which we've already discussed, or it's vague, and that doesn't help anybody, because all it leads to is an increase in radio chatter, and from you as a pilot, if you've not understood the intention of the pilots in the circuit, then it, again, can throw your mental model out, and you've actually got to work pretty hard to regain that degraded situation awareness that you might be in. Okay, just moving on. The next one we've got is just very similar stuff. We're talking about the workload management and your prioritization. So these are just a few things that can lead to distraction. And, you know, again, traffic is something that I think that's the obvious one. But how do we manage passengers? And I'll start with this one with you, Chris, if you wouldn't mind. In your aircraft, you probably find that there may be, I'm making a big statement here, but you might have more first-time flyers. How do you manage those passengers? How do you manage their expectations?
So it's about making them comfortable from the get-go, making sure they're reassured, but also setting expectations before the flight even starts. You know, when they can talk, when they can interrupt you. There's appropriate times where passengers should be communicating with us and when they shouldn't, especially at high workload situations like in the circuit, where we need to make a base call. We don't want to be having a chin wag.
Yep.
The other thing, of course, is one that kind of catches me out every once in a while, is remember the sick bags. Dealing with a sick passenger, it does actually take a lot of attention. Mostly because I don't like sick on me, but you know, that's got to, it's something that has to be managed. And actually, I have been known to leave the circuit where passengers being sick just to get away if it's very busy. Let the passenger calm down, get into some smoother air, re-establish, and then come in and land as quickly as possible in appropriate procedure. But you know, just taking myself away from a major distraction in a very busy environment.
Okay, so yeah, that's again that sort of extracting yourself from the situation, and buying yourself a bit of time, I suppose, and sort of, you know, again, remembering we talked about time pressure earlier. You know, don't put yourself under any pressures that can really be managed. What about unexpected events, Neil? How do you teach? You know, we often sort of teach people emergency procedures within the circuit. What if you've got something unexpected and something they haven't seen before? How do you sort of prepare your students for that?
Going back to the basics, and that's always to fly the aeroplane. Look, it's a very difficult one to answer because it could be a whole myriad of different things. But if something is unexpected, you've got to determine whether it's an airframe, an aeroplane-related thing, whether it's someone who's cut you off in a circuit, whatever it might be, and that's going to prompt a different reaction, a different response from you. But at the end of the day, you've got to fly the aeroplane. And if you're happy that that's occurring, well, then you've got time to then go through the analysis process of what's going on around you, and deal with those unexpected events, such as someone cutting inside you, someone who has made an incorrect call where they're actually on base rather than on downwind, which we've probably all heard before, and just again analyse what's going on, and then do what you need to do to handle the situation. Back to the threat and error management basics. So,
in my training days, I was sort of reminded to keep the normal in the abnormal, and by that we mean that sort of there are things that you're going to have to do when you're dealing with an abnormal situation within an aircraft. So it would be something that's you know, faulty gauges or you know, undercarriage or whatever it might be. You know, always remember to do the other normal stuff as well. You know, which that kind of remind you that there are other people out there who, you know, don't necessarily know that you're having a problem. You can announce that if you want, but certainly unexpected events, you know, try and keep the normal in the abnormal when you're dealing with it. Finally, just Stefan, do you have a policy on use of electronic devices approaching a circuit? Because or even in the circuit, do you use anything for situation awareness?
Yeah, definitely. If we're referring to phones, for example, then yeah, it's similar to sterile cockpit. Whenever you get to a certain stage, like the circuit, for example, obviously you got to make sure you put them away because it just serves as a major distraction. Ideally, we wouldn't want our students to use phones at any point, even if they're doing long navigational exercises. But we do understand that that's very difficult to police, and there might be times where, you know, on a long nav, maybe the student will just text the instructor just to let them know they're running behind in the ETA or something like that. But it's just important we make it clear from the start that there are times where absolutely those phones need to go away. It does change a bit with, you know, maybe carriage of EFBs. That's something where we're discussing electronic flight bags, for those who don't know, use of Oz runways or what's the other one called, AVPLAN. I think, yeah, that's something that a lot of flight schools are discussing at the moment in terms of whether schools want to go towards starting to train students on how to use that. So that's a different story, but definitely when the situation calls for it, like a circuit or on descent or on a climb, absolutely they need to go away, and you just need to focus on flying the aircraft, going back to that aviate, navigate, communicate.
Certainly, that's great. Thanks, Stefan. Certainly from an airline perspective, you can use the electronic devices, and I'll just put them all in the one basket here and talk about things like traffic collision avoidance systems. Those things will, you know, are really good. They'll definitely tell you where the other traffic is. You know, ADS-B obviously is getting better, so that's improving our situational awareness within the circuit, but it's also got to be managed because, as we all know, the traffic is outside, and by the time you've looked at traffic on a device inside the cockpit, and then you've tried to acquire it on the outside, you've lost some valuable time. If you do have a sophisticated traffic collision avoidance system, it'll give you a resolutionary advisory, which as an airline or anybody really, you don't question that, you just respond to it straight away. But they're good for acquiring situation awareness, I guess, on descent, or at least approaching a busy traffic area. But certainly once you're in the circuit, it's I think visual acquisition is probably your best form of defence. Any thoughts on that, Neil?
Yeah, I agree 100%. All of our aircraft have got a traffic system in them, and the way that the students are taught to use that is a situational awareness tool approaching the circuit, and then once you're actually entering the circuit, you've got to visually sight each of the individual traffic items in that circuit, and once you're established within the circuit, we don't really reference a TCAS inside the aircraft at all. Once you've entered the circuit, you're visually separating yourself from other traffic, and the traffic system then becomes a last-ditch thing if you've got something wrong, where you'll get a traffic alert or similar, but it is not the be-all and end-all. In fact, when you look at a traffic system, and even though they've got range rings on them and all that, ranging an aeroplane from what you see in the cockpit to looking outside can be quite difficult. So it's not a fallback position, it's an enhancement.
Fair enough. Okay, just moving on, last couple of slides here, and then we'll open to some conversation. Attention, as we've got there in the topic, is a finite resource. So, as I used the terminology earlier on about multitasking, but it's a bit of a fallacy, really. We don't really sort of multitask. We sort of do one thing and then go ahead on and do another thing, but we don't necessarily do them all really that well. We're kind of pretty familiar with overload when we get overloaded with tasks. Underload is another one that is equally as important. And you might not think that you're going to get underloaded going into a circuit area, but if you're the only aircraft that's going in, and you've made all your calls, there's nobody out there, you can sort of fit into this sort of complacency sort of footprint, I suppose. And I used to fly with a guy, and his best when things were going like that, he would say things are going suspiciously well. And what he was basically saying to us there was, hey, what have we forgotten? And so if you find yourself getting very comfortable and that sort of complacency starting to sort of wash over you, we know that when you're complacent, you're actually less likely to pick up on anything that changes in your vicinity and your environment. So try and avoid that. We've spoken about the other two, fixation and loss of control in the circuit. So we'll just move on to the last part, which brings us to sterile cockpit. Not everybody's familiar with what that is. And just as a brief sort of description here, it's as it says, it's during critical flight stages. You minimize any distractions from the priorities of flying the aircraft, which we keep sort of talking about here: aviate, navigate, and communicate. We discussed briefing your passengers. CASA does produce a passenger briefing card, and I think these are really important, because if you do happen to have a passenger coming out to a general aviation light aircraft and they've never flown in one before, likelihood is they've been on a larger aircraft. Now, if you're able to give them a briefing to the same standard as they would be getting on a Qantas or a Virgin or a Rex, then you're showing them that you've got a level of professionalism. So to help with that, we've sort of come up with this passenger briefing card, which is available online. And I think, again, it just sort of says to people that we've got this professionalism with us. And part of the sterile cockpit, or part of the briefing card, does talk about talking and the expectations as to when it's okay for a passenger to possibly interrupt you with a discussion, etc. And you might put something together. You might sort of say to the passenger, well, look, when I raise my hand, it's because I'm on the radio. Or if you hear me talking, I'm not talking to you necessarily. I'm talking to somebody on the radio, etc. So that's part of the sterile cockpit is basically getting rid of any distractions. Now, in the circuit, that is a critical flight stage. So, you've got your takeoff, your landing, it's all happening quite quickly. So brief your passengers. Another couple of things you could do is put away any electronic devices, phones, etc., well before you're entering the circuit, so they don't distract you. And keep a tidy cockpit. There's nothing worse than sort of getting some turbulence in the circuit on downwind and having your flight computer fall between your legs and go underneath a rudder pedal or something like that. It's pretty embarrassing, I can tell you that from experience. So those are the sort of things that we're looking at with the sterile cockpit. Anything to add to that from you, Stefan? Is that something that you sort of train your pilots to do?
Yeah, I agree with everything you summed up there. Yeah, from flight one, we do teach sterile cockpit, and we do also teach, just maintaining a certain level of, standard and a professionalism. Even things as small as, from wearing uniform for our students, for example,
right.
It just sets a certain precedence to them and keeping the aircraft clean. I'm very big on when I go out there, I want to make sure that the windows are clean, that the aircraft's clean as well. It just, puts a certain level of professionalism on them, and then they try and maintain that throughout their flying. And if from starting on the ground, if you maintain that early, it just makes everything flow a lot smoothly from there.
Right. But, yep. Sorry. Go on, Stefan.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, we definitely do brief all our students from the first flight about sterile cockpit, and then throughout their training, they're fairly aware of when they are expected to speak and when they're not expected to speak, depending on whether the operation calls for it or not.
Right, and Chris, that would be something that RAAus would be promoting, I would imagine, too, within your organisation.
Yes, certainly. I was actually just going to mention one of the issues that we perhaps have or share with GA is the size of our cockpits, which are rather small, and so there is more opportunity for the student or the passenger to come into contact with the primary flight controls or secondary flight controls.
Yep.
And so that is something that's just very, very important to brief the passenger on. I know when still do fly GA, but most of the aircraft we flew had a yoke, whereas most of the RAAus aircraft I'm flying now have sticks, and it's quite easy to bump passengers' legs, or if they sit slightly sideways and then you can't get full right aileron, or so just making sure your passengers are aware of the space that you need within the cockpit to operate the aircraft safely.
Fantastic. Okay, just coming up towards the end, I'm cognizant of the time right now. Just finally, I suppose I'll go to you, Neil, first. Just is there anything we can do as pilots when we're not actually flying to sort of increase our I suppose our skill level at situational awareness? Do you recommend anything? Is there anything we can do?
Absolutely. And a lot of it, 90% of it in my mind, comes down to your pre-flight preparation. If you're about to step into the aeroplane and go on a navigation exercise, or you're just going from here to Mildura or wherever it may be, you've got to know what's going on all the way along that flight. You should have an expectation of what runway you're going to be using when you get to your destination aerodrome. You've got forecasts, you've got AWIS, you've got all sorts of ways of developing a plan, a broad plan of what's going on before you even step in the aircraft. And all you're doing then when you get in the aeroplane is just confirming that your plan is still going to be valid, or if things have changed, then formulate another plan well and truly before it becomes a critical phase or become a critical part of what's going to happen in the immediate future. So being well ahead of the aircraft, we've touched on that, and that is the key to it. Well ahead of the aircraft starts before you get in it.
Fantastic. Stefan, just on it's a wet day. you're sitting around the pilot lounge at your establishment, and you're talking about situational awareness. Is there a way that you can sort of almost give some of your information to the students? What do you do? How do you sort of get them to start thinking about situational awareness, even if when they're not actually in an aeroplane?
Yeah, stuff that we can do on the ground. I try and get them to think about procedures on a broader scope. So there's a lot of procedures in place that, for example, quite often you'll find that non-towered aerodromes, we fly left-handed circuits, but all right, this particular aerodrome has a right-handed circuit. Why do you think that is? So getting them to go away and think about procedures in a broader spectrum in terms of why they exist in certain scenarios, and then they sort of allow themselves to paint a certain picture. And from there, they can think, all right, well, if this is a right-hand circuit, why does this exist? What are additional things I need to think of? Also, as my job as a safety manager, I try and make our instructors and students aware of different ATSB reports or certain cases that could definitely be relevant to them. And being aware of those different case studies or incident reports, they can sort of attribute that to what they're doing in their flight training, and it just means they're aware of certain mistakes that could happen or how you can lose situational awareness, and then attribute that to their flight training. So just excellent. Yeah, no, that's really good, and I was hoping you were going to go down that track. I don't know if everybody can see it, but I've got the fantastic magazine that CASA puts out, Flight Safety Australia, and also Close Calls. So we quite often do have the articles in there that relate to people who have sort of lost situational awareness. They've written about it, so it's great. So we can learn from other people as well. Okay, gentlemen, just a bit of a sales job for our aviation safety seminars. We're talking at the moment in our safety seminars about an accident that occurred at Caloundra in September 2022, which is a situational awareness being lost accident. And if you're not familiar with it, we're talking about it both in the pilot hub and also face-to-face at our AB safeties. And it's a really interesting case study that, we don't blame anybody in any of our case studies. We just go down the ATSB reporting the factual information, but it's a really good case study to get your teeth into, and it's absolutely right on target for what we're talking about today. In conclusion, there's a few hints and tips. Plan ahead, anticipate the traffic mix, manage distractions, establish a sterile cockpit rule. Definitely fly within your personal limits. Don't overload yourself. Know what you can and can't handle, and don't overload yourself. If you find yourself being overloaded, listen to what the experts have just told you about sort of, getting yourself out of there and getting yourself into a situation where you know where everything's happening. If in doubt, ask. If it's a controlled aerodrome, which we're not talking about necessarily here, resolve any ambiguities. If you don't understand what the other aircraft is doing, you can ask them. Don't assume that you've understood what they're telling you. And of course, the golden rule: aviate, navigate, communicate. So that brings to an end the series on operations around non-controlled aerodromes. 4 webinars. They'll all be available on the Pilot Safety Hub. Again, your safety is in your hands is the current program. As from the next few weeks, we'll be running another series of webinars on weather and forecasting, and we'll try and continue these over the next few months in having various topics. So I would like to really thank the guys from the industry, because without you, we really don't have much to talk about. So for Neil and Stefan and Chris, thank you very much. Really appreciate you giving your time. And I'll leave it open now to any questions. If anybody wants to ask any questions of the panel, we can do that.
I don't know if Richard, one of the guests, is still on, but he asked a very good question. He asked if there was a disadvantage or other consideration in performing an orbit whilst on downwind to allow another aircraft to overtake, or to simply adjust your position in the circuit. And if that's okay with you, can I answer that?
You can answer it. If I don't agree with your answer, I'll give my opinion as well. But look, that's what we're here for. Absolutely, go ahead and answer it.
So it's an interesting one, because it's one that comes up. But certainly, conducting an orbit, I would strongly advise against it. Simply because if you turn to the right, you're going to confuse other people in the circuit to think that you're cutting them short. If you turn left to make a left orbit, you might have a fast aircraft like a twin or a another aircraft that's flying a wider circuit, and you're potentially going to land up on a head-on collision. So both those circumstances, orbiting left or orbiting right, I feel would put you in an unnecessarily dangerous situation. If you have time and you're not in a particular rush, you can slow the aircraft down or power the aircraft up and actually rejoin overhead and rejoin the circuit. But certainly I could not find a situation which would encourage anybody to make an orbit on downwind or even extend downwind. I think is just another situation which creates an additional hazard. So we do need to stick to the advised standard procedures within the circuit.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. What do you think, Stefan, for that one? I'll put it to you.
Yeah, I agree with Chris. You shouldn't, when you're on the live side of the circuit, you shouldn't do anything that's not procedural. So I would, either climb back up to overfly height and maneuver as required. There are scenarios where, if your communication is sufficient, depending on how busy the circuit is, you can maybe extend your upwind leg until the other aircrafts turn crosswind, and then once you've got them in sight, you can follow them. But I absolutely agree with Chris that the best case scenario is always just get out of the circuit, climb back to overfly height, and rejoin when you think it's safe to do so.
Yep.
Rather than maneuvering on the live side.
I don't need to ask you, Neil, but I'll put it to you. I expect you'll have a similar answer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would agree 100%. Any manoeuvring in the circuit, such as an orbit, is going to create a blind spot, whether you're a high wing or a low wing. I'd avoid it at all costs.
I hope if it was Richard that was answering that question, if you relate back to some of the stuff that the SMEs or subject matter experts have told us earlier, just extract yourself from that situation, but be predictable. You can imagine yourself if you do an orbit in the circuit, that's not predictable. That's something I don't particularly want to be sort of head to head with you on a downwind leg. So just fly the circuit. Again, time pressures. We've got plenty of time. Just extract yourself from the situation, fly the circuit, and I think that's as you've just found from all of us, that would be the correct way of going about it. Any other questions? If there are no more questions, thank you very much to everybody who's attended today. We hope it's been worthwhile. Again, I believe any of this education is really worthwhile. It's a very important safety initiative from CASA. Once again, your safety is in your hands.